I'm Edward, your host, glad to have your company this evening. A warm greeting to our listeners in Washington. I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what was the name of your best childhood friend. Don't forget to subscribe for daily mysteries. Now, get comfortable, and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. A Prayer Heard After Midnight. The village of St. Mary Mead lay quiet under the late October sky, its chimneys sending thin columns of smoke into the gathering dusk. It was that peculiar hour when respectable people drew their curtains against the evening chill and settled themselves by their fires, content in the knowledge that another day had passed without undue excitement or disturbance to the natural order of things. Miss Jane Marple, knitting a particularly intricate section of a bed jacket destined for the October jumble sale, glanced up from her needles as her nephew Raymond refilled her teacup. He had arrived that afternoon from London, bringing with him the faint air of restlessness that seemed to attach itself to young men who worked in what they called the city, and who found village life rather too quiet for comfort. "I must say, Aunt Jane," Raymond remarked, settling himself into the armchair opposite, "I don't know how you bear it. Nothing ever happens here." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. "Oh, I wouldn't say that, dear. There's always something happening if one knows where to look. Mrs. Price's youngest has just become engaged to the chemist's nephew, though I fancy his mother had her hopes of the doctor's daughter. And Colonel Melrose's dog got into the vicar's garden again and made quite a mess of the autumn cabbages." Raymond laughed. "Hardly the stuff of drama, Aunt." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though I've often found that the small disturbances of daily life can be quite as revealing as the larger ones. Human nature, you know, is much the same whether one is deciding whom to marry or which vegetable marrow to enter in the village show." It was at that moment that Mrs. Bantry arrived, her motor car making rather more noise than was strictly necessary as it pulled up before the gate. Lady Bantry, as she had been these past 15 years since Sir Henry's knighthood, was a handsome woman in her late 50s, given to tweeds of excellent quality, and a manner that suggested she had never quite recovered from the shock of finding herself addressed as "your ladyship" by people who had known her since she was Dolly Price and ran wild through the rectory gardens. Miss Marple set aside her knitting as her friend swept into the sitting room, bringing with her a gust of cold air and an expression of barely contained agitation. "Jane, the most extraordinary thing has happened. Well, perhaps not extraordinary exactly, but certainly peculiar. You know old Sister Agnes at St. Aldhelm's convent?" Miss Marple did know Sister Agnes, though only by sight and reputation. The convent of St. Aldhelm lay perhaps half a mile beyond the village proper, a grey stone building that had once been a manor house, and now served as home to a small community of Anglican sisters who devoted themselves to prayer, contemplation, and the education of a handful of day pupils from the surrounding countryside. "I believe she's been unwell for some time," Miss Marple said quietly. "She died last night," Dolly Bantry announced, accepting the cup of tea that Raymond hastily poured for her. "Which is sad, of course, but not unexpected. She was 73, and de Haydock had been saying for months that her heart was failing. But Jane, the circumstances are rather odd." Miss Marple's blue eyes, which could appear quite vague and innocent when she chose, sharpened slightly. "Indeed. You know the Fletchers who live in that cottage just beyond the convent wall? Well, Mrs. Fletcher was telling me this morning that she and her husband both heard something peculiar last night. It must have been well after 11, perhaps closer to midnight. They'd already retired, but neither of them could sleep because of the wind, and they both distinctly heard a woman's voice praying aloud." "From the convent?" Raymond asked, interested despite himself. "It must have been," Lady Bantry said. "The voice was quite clear," Mrs. Fletcher said, though she couldn't make out the words, just the rhythm of it, you know, like someone reciting prayers very deliberately. Slowly and with great feeling she said. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though her attention was clearly elsewhere. "And this was unusual?" "That's just it. Mother Superior mentioned this morning when she came to tell me about Sister Agnes's passing, that the poor woman hadn't spoken prayers aloud for many years. She was quite a reserved person, apparently, kept her devotions private and quiet. Mother Superior seemed rather surprised when I mentioned what the Fletchers had heard. Perhaps, Raymond suggested, the elderly nun knew her time was near and wished to make her peace in a more vocal fashion. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed softly, though one does wonder why someone who had been silent for so many years would choose that particular moment to pray aloud, and after Comline too, which would have been said in chapel with the other sisters. Lady Bantry looked at her friend with interest. You think it's significant? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that when people do something out of character, particularly at the end of their lives, there is usually a reason, though what that reason might be, I couldn't possibly say. When did they find her? This morning, at the usual time for rising. One of the younger sisters went to wake her and found her lying peacefully in her bed. Dr. Haydock was called, of course, and pronounced it heart failure. All quite natural and expected. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her needles clicking steadily. You said Mother Superior came to tell you herself. That was thoughtful of her. Well, I am a benefactor, Lady Bantry said, though she looked slightly uncomfortable. We've supported the convent for years, ever since Sir Henry's mother took an interest in their work. But yes, I did think it rather particular that she came in person. Usually such news would come through the chaplain, or perhaps a note. And what did Mother Superior say exactly? Dolly Bantry frowned, trying to recall the conversation precisely. She said that Sister Agnes had passed peacefully in the night, that it was a blessed release from suffering, and that the funeral would be held quite soon. Within the convent, you understand. She seemed to think that would be most appropriate, given Sister Agnes's years of service and her preference for quietness and solitude. No village attendance? Apparently not. Mother Superior was quite definite about it. She said that Sister Agnes would have wished for a simple service, just the community and the chaplain, all very private and peaceful. Raymond, who had been listening with the slightly superior expression of one who finds village gossip amusing, but beneath his notice, suddenly said, I suppose there's nothing unusual about any of this. An elderly nun dies naturally, and the convent handles the matter in their own way. Perfectly reasonable. Miss Marple looked at her nephew with affection. Perhaps you're right, dear, though I must confess I find myself wondering about that prayer. If no one was meant to hear it, why speak aloud? The walls of those old buildings are thick, you know. One would have to pray quite loudly indeed for the sound to carry through stone and across a garden to the cottage beyond. You think she wanted to be heard? Lady Bantry asked. I think, Miss Marple said gently, that when someone who's been silent for years suddenly speaks, they usually have something they wish to say. Whether anyone was meant to hear it, or whether anyone did hear what was truly being said, is another matter entirely. The conversation turned to other topics after that, and Raymond grew restless and excused himself to take a walk before dinner. But Lady Bantry remained, and when they were alone, she said quietly, You do think something is wrong, don't you, Jane? Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked at her friend with complete candour. I think, Dolly dear, that prayers spoken aloud in the middle of the night by someone who has been silent for decades are rather like letters written and then burned. They are meant to serve a purpose, even if that purpose is not immediately clear to those who discover them. What sort of purpose? A confession, perhaps, or a warning, or possibly, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, a kind of testimony, something that needed to be said, even if the speaker knew they might not be alive to explain it further. Lady Bantry shivered slightly, though the fire was warm. That's rather a grim thought. Death often is, my dear, but it needn't be a troubling one. Sister Agnes may simply have wished to make her peace with God in her own way. There are many reasons why someone might pray aloud after so many years of silence. But you think there's more to it? Miss Marple smiled, a gentle expression that softened her already soft features. I think that human beings are endlessly complicated, Dolly, and that even the quietest life may contain secrets worth keeping. Whether Sister Agnes's secrets died with her, or whether they remain to be discovered, I couldn't possibly say, but I do find myself rather curious about that prayer she spoke, and about why Mother Superior thought it necessary to come and tell you about the death in person, when a note would have sufficed. She picked up her knitting once more, and the needles resumed their comfortable rhythm. Outside, the October evening deepened into night, and somewhere beyond the village, in a grey stone building that had once been a manor house, the sisters of St. Aldhelm's convent said their evening prayers in silence, and prepared to lay one of their own to rest. But in Miss Marple's sitting room, the question lingered like smoke from a fire that has not quite gone out. Why pray aloud if no one is meant to hear? Chapter 2. The Cell with the Cold Hearth. The invitation to visit St. Aldhelm's convent arrived the following morning, delivered by hand in an envelope of heavy cream paper that bore the convent seal pressed into dark blue wax. Miss Marple received it from her maid Clara, who remarked that the young sister who had brought it looked pale and troubled, though perhaps that was only natural given the recent bereavement. Miss Marple opened the envelope with care, unfolding a single sheet written in a hand so precise and upright that it might have been composed with a ruler beneath each line. Mother Superior presents her compliments, the letter began, and would be grateful if Miss Marple might find it convenient to call at the convent parlour this afternoon at 3 o'clock. There is a small matter concerning the late Sister Agnes's effects, which Mother Superior believes might benefit from Miss Marple's particular discretion and understanding. It was, Miss Marple reflected, as she set the letter aside, a very carefully worded request. Not a summons, certainly, and yet not quite the casual invitation one might extend to a neighbour for tea. The phrase particular discretion suggested that Mother Superior had heard something of Miss Marple's reputation for unravelling difficulties that others might prefer to leave tangled. At 2:30, Miss Marple put on her better hat, the one with the modest veil that could be worn to church, or to houses where a certain formality was expected, and walked the half-mile to St. Aldhelm's. The October afternoon was crisp and bright, the sort of weather that made the world seem sharply defined, each leaf and stone standing out with particular clarity. The convent presented a forbidding aspect from the road, its grey walls and narrow windows suggesting centuries of enclosure and contemplation. But the entrance, when Miss Marple approached it, revealed a more welcoming character. The door stood within a Norman archway, and beside it hung an iron bell on a chain that had been polished smooth by generations of hands. Miss Marple pulled the chain and waited. The door was opened almost immediately by a young nun whose face bore that peculiar combination of serenity and anxiety that Miss Marple had observed in novices of various denominations. The girl could not have been more than 25, and her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were ink-stained in a way that suggested she served as the convent's secretary or record-keeper. "Miss Marple, Mother Superior is accepting you, if you would be so kind as to follow me." They passed through a vestibule hung with dark portraits of ecclesiastical gentlemen in various states of episcopal dignity, then along a corridor that smelled faintly of beeswax and lavender. The young nun's shoes made almost no sound on the flagstones, while Miss Marple's own steps seemed embarrassingly loud in the prevailing silence. The parlour, when they reached it, proved to be a small, pleasant room with windows overlooking what must once have been the manor's formal garden. Mother Superior rose from a high-backed chair as Miss Marple entered, and extended her hand with a smile that managed to be both warm and reserved. "Miss Marple, how very kind of you to come at such short notice." Mother Superior was perhaps 60, a tall woman with the sort of face that would have been handsome in youth and had aged into something more compelling than mere beauty. Her eyes were grey and remarkably direct, and her voice carried the cultivated accent of someone educated at one of the better schools before taking up a vocation that required the setting aside of worldly advantages. "Not at all, Mother Superior. I was glad to receive your invitation, though I confess myself uncertain how I might be of service. Please do sit down." Mother Superior gestured to a chair upholstered in faded green velvet. "Sister Perpetua, would you bring tea? And perhaps you might ask Sister Claire to join us. I believe Miss Marple should hear what she has to say." The young nun departed, and Mother Superior seated herself once more, arranging her habit with the unconscious grace of long practice. "You will have heard, I expect, of Sister Agnes's passing. Lady Bantry mentioned it yesterday. Please accept my condolences. I understand she had been with your community for many years." 40 years this past August, Mother Superior said quietly. "She entered our order as a postulant in Tom 15, during the First War. A difficult time for everyone, of course, but particularly for young women who felt called to a life of service and prayer. Sister Agnes was one of our most devoted members, though perhaps not one of our most visible. She preferred silence and solitude, you understand, Liska." Miss Marple nodded. Lady Bantry mentioned that she did not speak her prayers aloud as a general practice. Something flickered in Mother Superior's grey eyes, too quick to be called relief, but suggestive of it. "Precisely, which is why Sister Clare's account has troubled me somewhat. Ah, here she is now." Sister Clare proved to be a woman of perhaps 40, with a round, pleasant face and capable hands that spoke of work in the garden or the kitchen rather than the scriptorium. She looked nervous as she entered the parlour, bobbing a small curtsy to Mother Superior before seating herself on the edge of a straight-back chair. "Sister Clare," Mother Superior said gently, "would you tell Miss Marple what you heard on the night Sister Agnes died?" Sister Clare twisted her hands together in her lap. "I was in my cell preparing for sleep. My room is 3 doors down from Sister Agnes's, along the east corridor. The walls are thick, you understand, but there are gaps under the doors, and sound carries in peculiar ways in old buildings." "What time was this?" Miss Marple asked. "It must have been nearly midnight. Compline had ended some time before, and I had already said my private prayers. I was just extinguishing my candle when I heard it." "The voice?" "Yes, Miss Marple. A woman's voice, speaking prayers, quite distinctly. Not loudly, you understand, but clearly, as if she wanted to be certain the words were pronounced correctly. Could you make out what was being said?" Sister Clare shook her head. "Not the words themselves, but the rhythm was unmistakable. It was the prayer for the departed, I'm almost certain. The cadence was quite particular." Miss Marple glanced at Mother Superior, who inclined her head slightly. "A prayer for someone who has died? Yes, that would be consistent with what Sister Clare heard." "I thought perhaps Sister Agnes was unwell," Sister Clare continued, "or perhaps troubled in her mind. So I rose and went to her door. I knocked very softly, not wanting to disturb the others, and when there was no answer, I opened the door just a fraction." She paused, and Mother Superior said quietly, "Go on, sister." "Sister Agnes was sitting up in the bed, quite composed. She was holding something in her hands, looking down at it. A paper of some kind, I thought. And she was speaking the prayer quite deliberately, as if reading from it. When she saw me at the door, she said, 'It is better so.' Just those words. Then she turned away, and I withdrew. I thought it best not to intrude upon her devotions." "Most considerate," Miss Marple murmured. "And did you hear anything further?" "No, Miss Marple. I returned to my cell and shortly after fell asleep. In the morning, when Sister Agnes did not appear at Lord's, Sister Perpetua went to wake her and found her at peace. The Superior thanked Sister Clare, who departed with evident relief." When they were alone again, Mother Superior poured tea with steady hands and offered Miss Marple a cup. "You see my difficulty," Mother Superior said. "Dr. Haydock assures me that Sister Agnes's death was entirely natural. Her heart had been failing for months, and yet these circumstances trouble me. You wish to be certain there was nothing amiss?" "I wish to be certain," Mother Superior said carefully, "that Sister Agnes's death was as peaceful as it appeared, and I wish to understand what she burned that night." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Burned? If you would come with me, I can show you." They walked through silent corridors to the east wing, where the sisters' cells were arranged along a passage lit by narrow windows. Sister Agnes's door stood open, and the room beyond was as austere as Miss Marple had expected. A narrow bed, a wooden chair, a small desk, and a fireplace no larger than was necessary to take the chill from winter mornings. But it was the fireplace that drew Miss Marple's attention immediately. The grate was cold, entirely cold, though the day was sharp enough that one might have expected a small fire to be burning. More tellingly, there was wood laid ready in the hearth, arranged with the precision of someone who had performed the task countless times. Kindling at the base, larger pieces above, the whole ready to be lit with a single match. It was like this when Sister Perpetua found her, Mother Superior said quietly. The fire had been prepared the evening before, as it always was, but never lit. Miss Marple knelt with some difficulty beside the hearth, peering into the cold grate. There was ash there, certainly, but not the sort of ash that wood alone would produce. This was finer, more delicate, the kind that comes from paper burned completely. Sister Clare mentioned that Sister Agnes had burned something. Yes, Sister Perpetua noticed it as well when she came to prepare the body for the undertaking. She swept out this grate, as is customary, and remarked that the ash seemed unusually fine, almost like the remains of letters or documents. Miss Marple rose carefully, brushing her gloves clean. And the window? Mother Superior looked startled. The window, the latch, is undone. They both looked at the narrow casement window which stood slightly ajar. The iron latch hung loose, and a thin draught stirred the simple curtain. Sister Agnes always kept her window latched, Mother Superior said slowly. She felt the cold terribly in her later years. Dr. Haydock had prescribed warmth and rest. She would never have left it open in October. Miss Marple moved to the window and examined it carefully. The latch showed no signs of force or damage. It had been opened deliberately from the inside. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, she wished for air. Sometimes, at the end, people feel a great need for freshness. Perhaps, Mother Superior echoed, though her tone suggested she found this explanation insufficient. Miss Marple turned from the window and surveyed the small, neat room. The bed had been stripped, the mattress aired, everything made ready for the next occupant, as was the practical custom in communities where sentiment could not be permitted to waste resources. But on the desk lay a few items that had apparently been set aside. A worn prayer book, a rosary of simple wooden beads, and a small tin box such as might be used for keeping letters or keepsakes. These were her personal effects. All that she had. Sister Agnes owned nothing beyond what you see. The prayer book was given to her when she took her final vows, and the rosary she brought with her when she first entered as a postulant. The box contained only a few items of no particular value. A pressed flower, a ribbon bookmark, a photograph so faded one can barely make out the faces. No letters? None. Sister Agnes received no correspondence in all the years I have known her. She seemed to have no family, no connections to the world beyond these walls. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mild eyes taking in every detail of the austere cell. And yet she burned something the night she died. Something that required she speak a prayer for the departed, aloud so that someone might hear and remember. Mother Superior met her gaze. You think it's significant? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that when someone who's kept silence for 40 years suddenly speaks, one must pay very close attention to what they choose to say, and when they choose to burn something rather than leave it behind, one must wonder what they wish to destroy, and why they felt it necessary to do so at the very end. She looked once more at the cold hearth, the unlatched window, the stripped bed where an elderly nun had died alone in the night. Tell me, Mother Superior, have there been any visitors to the convent recently? Anyone asking after Sister Agnes or her history? Mother Superior hesitated, and in that hesitation, Miss Marple found her answer. There was someone, Miss Marple said softly. Wasn't there? Chapter 3. An erased line in the convent register. Mother Superior's silence was answer enough, though it lasted only a moment, before she straightened her shoulders with the air of someone who has decided that evasion serves no useful purpose. There was a woman, she said at last. 3 days before Sister Agnes died, she came to the outer gate and asked to speak with Sister Agnes specifically. Did she give her name? She said her name was Mrs. Thornton, a respectable-looking person, middle-aged, well-dressed in a quiet way. She said she had known Sister Agnes many years ago, before she entered the convent, and wished to pay her respects to an old friend. Miss Marple's needles would have clicked thoughtfully had she been knitting. As it was, her fingers merely touched the clasp of her handbag in a gesture that served the same contemplative purpose. "And did you permit the visit?" I did not see any reason to refuse it. Sister Agnes was at liberty to receive visitors, though she never had done so in all my years as Mother Superior. I asked if she wished to see this Mrs. Thornton, and after some hesitation she agreed. They spoke together in the visitors' parlour for perhaps 20 minutes. Was anyone else present? Sister Perpetua attended them, as is customary. She sat in the corner with her needlework and took no part in the conversation, but she would have heard what was said if either woman had raised her voice. And did they? Mother Superior shook her head. Sister Perpetua reported that the conversation was conducted in low tones throughout. She could make out nothing beyond the occasional word. When the visit concluded, Mrs. Thornton departed, and Sister Agnes returned to her cell. She seemed agitated, Sister Perpetua thought, though it was difficult to be certain. Sister Agnes was not one to display her feelings readily. Miss Marple considered this information while gazing out the narrow window at the convent garden below, where a few late roses still bloomed against the ancient stone wall. Did Mrs. Thornton leave any message or indication that she might return? None. Sister Perpetua said she thanked Sister Agnes for her time, and left in a manner that suggested the interview had been unsatisfactory in some way. Not acrimonious, you understand, but incomplete. As if there were more to be said, but the right words could not be found. Precisely. Mother Superior moved toward the door, and Miss Marple followed her back along the quiet corridor. I wonder, Miss Marple, if you might wish to see our register. There is something about it that has troubled me, though I hesitate to suggest that anything is actively amiss. They descended a narrow staircase to a room that served as the convent's office, a space dominated by a large oak desk and shelves lined with ledgers bound in dark leather. Mother Superior selected one volume and laid it open on the desk, turning the pages with careful fingers until she reached the section marked with a black ribbon. "This is our death register," she explained. "It records every sister who has passed while in our care. See here, this is Sister Agnes's entry." Miss Marple leaned forward, adjusting her spectacles. The entry was written in the same precise hand she had seen on Mother Superior's letter that morning, each word formed with meticulous care. Sister Agnes Mary Cunningham, professed 1917, departed this life 28th of October 1955, aged 73 years, cause heart failure, burial, St. Aldhelm's Cemetery, 30th of October 1955. "A very proper record," Miss Marple observed, "and yet you said something troubled you about it." "At the line above." Miss Marple's eyes moved upward to the previous entry, and she saw at once what Mother Superior meant. The line that recorded the death before Sister Agnes's had been written, then carefully scraped away and rewritten. The paper showed the telltale roughness of erasure, and though the new writing was as neat as the rest, the ink sat slightly differently on the abraded surface. Sister Catherine Rose Blackwell, professed 1923, departed this 12th September 1955, aged 68 years, cause pneumonia, burial, St. Aldhelm's Cemetery, 14th September 1955. Sister Catherine died just 6 weeks ago, Mother Superior said quietly. The original entry was made at the time, as is our custom, but several days later I noticed it had been altered. In what way? The date had been changed. Originally it read 13th September, but it now reads 12th of September. A small difference, perhaps, but our records are meant to be exact. When I made inquiries, Sister Perpetua admitted she had made the correction. She said she had initially recorded the wrong date in error and had corrected it when she realized her mistake. Miss Marple studied the altered line with great attention. And you doubted this explanation? Sister Perpetua is our record keeper. She is scrupulous about such matters. In 15 years, I have never known her to make an error in the registers. Moreover, when corrections are made, it is our custom to initial them and note the reason for the change in the margin. This correction bears no such notation. Have you asked Sister Perpetua about the missing initials? I have. She seemed confused by the question and said she must have forgotten in the distress of Sister Catherine's passing. It is possible, of course. Sister Catherine was much loved, and her death affected us all deeply. Miss Marple straightened, removing her spectacles and polishing them thoughtfully with her handkerchief. May I ask what Sister Catherine died of? Pneumonia, as the register states. She contracted it quite suddenly in early September, and declined rapidly despite Dr. Haydock's best efforts. She was elderly and had never been robust. And Sister Agnes attended her during her illness? Mother Superior looked surprised. Why, yes. Sister Agnes had some skill in nursing learned during the First War when she worked briefly in a convalescent home before entering our order. She often sat with the sick. How did you know? I didn't, Miss Marple said mildly. Oh, I merely wondered. 2 deaths so close together in a small community would naturally bring the members into proximity with one another. And if Sister Agnes had some particular connection to Sister Catherine, it might explain why her own passing affected her so deeply. I'm not certain I follow your meaning. Miss Marple replaced her spectacles and turned to face Mother Superior directly. You said Sister Agnes seemed agitated after Mrs. Thornton's visit. 3 days later, she burns some papers, speaks a prayer for the departed loud enough to be heard by others, and dies in the night. In between those events, someone has altered the register to change a date by a single day. It may all be coincidence, of course, but I have found that coincidences in matters of death are rather less common than one might suppose. Mother Superior's grey eyes were troubled. You think there is some connection between these events? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that human beings are creatures of habit and pattern. When those patterns are disrupted, particularly in a community as ordered as yours, it suggests that something has occurred to disturb the usual rhythm of life. Sister Agnes kept silence for 40 years and then spoke aloud. Sister Perpetua, who never makes errors, made an error and forgot to initial her correction. Mrs. Thornton visited after decades of absence and left without achieving her purpose. These disruptions may be entirely innocent, but they form a pattern nonetheless. What sort of pattern? Miss Marple closed the register gently, her fingers resting on the worn leather cover. The sort that suggests someone was looking for something, or trying to understand something, or perhaps trying to correct something that had gone wrong long ago. Dates matter, Mother, Superior, particularly in official records. If someone changes a date, even by a single day, they usually have a reason for doing so. But what reason could there be for changing the date of Sister Catherine's death? That, Miss Marple said quietly, is precisely what we must discover. Tell me, was there anything unusual about the day Sister Catherine died? Anything that might have made the exact date significant? Mother Superior frowned, considering. Not that I recall. It was a Thursday, I believe, a perfectly ordinary day in most respects. Sister Catherine was unconscious by then, had been for some hours. She slipped away peacefully just after dawn. And the weather? The question seemed to puzzle Mother Superior. The weather? I'm afraid I don't recall specifically. Early September would have been mild, I expect, perhaps some rain. We had a wet autumn that year. No frost, no unusual cold? Not in September, certainly, though we did have an unseasonable cold snap later in the month. I remember it particularly because we had to bring the tender plants in from the garden earlier than usual. Miss Marple nodded slowly, as if this information confirmed something she had already suspected. And Sister Agnes? Did she seem troubled after Sister Catherine's death? Now that you mention it, yes. I attributed it to grief, naturally. They had been sisters together for many years, but she did become more withdrawn than usual. She spent hours alone in her cell, and Sister Perpetua mentioned that she had requested certain old records from our archives. What sort of records? The registers from the 1930s, I believe. Sister Perpetua thought she was perhaps composing a memorial or history of the community. Sister Agnes had a scholarly turn of mind when she was younger. And did she compose such a history? If she did, she never presented it. And now, of course, whatever papers she had accumulated, she appears to have burned on the night she died. God. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant with thought. Then she said very gently, "Mother Superior, I wonder if you would permit me to look at those records Sister Agnes requested, the registers from the 1930s. Of course, if you think it might be helpful, but I'm not certain what you expect to find there." "Neither am I," Miss Marple admitted. "But I have learned over the years that when someone takes the trouble to burn papers rather than simply discard them, those papers usually contain information that someone wishes to conceal. And when someone alters a date in a register, even by a single day, they are trying to make the record conform to some version of events that may not be entirely accurate." She looked once more at the death register, at the careful entries recording the end of 2 lives lived within these grey stone walls. "The truth," she said softly, "has a way of persisting, even when we try to erase it. And I suspect that Sister Agnes, in her final hours, was trying to ensure that some particular truth would not be lost entirely, even if she could not bring herself to speak it plainly." Mother Superior closed the register and returned it to its shelf, her movements deliberate and composed. "I will have Sister Perpetua bring the old registers to the parlour, though I confess, Miss Marple, I am not entirely certain what we are looking for." "Nor am I," Miss Marple said, "but I believe Sister Agnes knew, and I believe she tried in her own way to tell us before she died." Chapter 4, A Funeral Held Too Quickly. The funeral of Sister Agnes took place on the morning of the 30th of October, a grey Tuesday that brought with it the first real intimation of winter. Miss Marple learned of the date quite by accident, when Dr. Haydock mentioned it while calling at her cottage to leave some tablets for her rheumatism, which had been troubling her in the damp weather. "Burying the old nun today," he remarked, setting down his medical bag and accepting the cup of tea that Miss Marple poured for him. "Quick work, I must say, though I suppose they have their own ways of managing these matters." "Today?" Miss Marple set down the teapot with rather more care than was strictly necessary. "But she only died on Friday night. That's scarcely 4 days." Dr. Haydock shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both his general acceptance of ecclesiastical peculiarities and his mild disapproval of anything that deviated from what he considered proper medical protocol. "Mother Superior was quite insistent when I signed the certificate. Said Sister Agnes had expressed a wish for a simple, quiet burial without delay. Nothing wrong with that, I suppose. Heart failure's straightforward enough, and in this weather there's no particular reason to wait. Still, it does seem rather hurried." He stirred his tea thoughtfully, his weathered face wearing the expression of a man who's seen enough of death to know that the living often act oddly in its immediate aftermath. "No service at the village church, then?" Miss Marple inquired. "Apparently not. Just the convent chapel and their own cemetery. Mother Superior said Sister Agnes wouldn't have wanted any fuss. All very private and seemly, no doubt, but it strikes me as a touch precipitate. The woman lived in St. Mary Mead before she took her vows, according to old Mrs. Henderson. You'd think there might be some villagers who'd want to pay their respects." After Dr. Haydock had departed, Miss Marple sat for some time in her sitting room, looking out at the garden where the last of the Michaelmas daisies were fading into November brown. The unseemly haste of the funeral troubled her in a way she found difficult to articulate, even to herself. There was nothing explicitly wrong with a quick burial, particularly when the cause of death was clear and the deceased had no close family, and yet the very speed of it suggested something that went beyond mere efficiency. It suggested, Miss Marple thought, someone's desire to have the matter concluded and sealed away before too many questions could be asked. She was still contemplating this when Lady Bantry arrived, her motor car announcing itself with the usual racket and her person following shortly afterwards in a state of some agitation. "Jane, have you heard?" They're burying Sister Agnes this very morning and not a soul from the village has been invited. I think it's perfectly disgraceful." "I had heard," Miss Marple said mildly. "Dr. Haydock mentioned it." "Do sit down, Dolly. You'll make yourself quite breathless carrying on so." Lady Bantry subsided into the armchair with an expression of considerable indignation. "I telephoned Mother Superior this morning to ask about arranging some flowers for the service, and she told me in the politest possible way that no flowers were required and no attendance was expected beyond the convent community itself. She said Sister Agnes had specifically requested the utmost simplicity." Perhaps she had. Perhaps. But Jane, it feels wrong somehow. Sister Agnes may have been a nun for 40 years, but she was born and raised not 3 miles from here. Mrs. Henderson remembers her as a girl, before the First War. Surely there should be some acknowledgement of that life, some connection to the village where she began. Miss Marple poured tea and handed a cup to her friend. "What does Mrs. Henderson remember of her?" Lady Bantry accepted the cup gratefully and considered the question. "Not a great deal, I'm afraid. Mrs. Henderson must have been quite young herself at the time, but she recalls a family called Cunningham who lived in one of the cottages beyond the church. 2 daughters, she thinks, though she can't remember the details. One of them must have been our Sister Agnes." "And the other?" "No idea. Mrs. Henderson said the family moved away during the war years, or perhaps just after. She lost track of them entirely. But she did say that one of the daughters was said to have been rather wild, though what that meant in those days I couldn't say. Probably nothing more scandalous than walking out with a young man without a proper chaperone." Miss Marple's needles had resumed their steady rhythm, though her mind was clearly engaged elsewhere. 2 sisters, and one of them entered a convent and remained there for 40 years, with no contact with her family or her past. "What are you thinking, Jane?" "I'm thinking," Miss Marple said slowly, "that people usually enter religious life for one of 2 reasons. Either they feel a genuine calling to serve God in that particular way, or they are running away from something they find unendurable in the world outside." "You think Sister Agnes was running away?" "I think 40 years of absolute silence suggests someone who had very good reasons for severing all connections with her former life, and I think a funeral conducted with such extraordinary haste suggests that someone wishes to ensure those connections remain severed." Lady Bantry set down her teacup with a decisive click. "I'm going to the funeral anyway. Mother Superior can't very well bar the gate against me. And if Sister Agnes was once a village girl, then the village has a right to see her properly laid to rest." A generous sentiment, Dolly, though perhaps not entirely tactful. "Tact be hanged! Are you coming with me?" Miss Marple considered this invitation for a moment, weighing propriety against curiosity and finding, as she often did, that curiosity held the stronger claim. "I believe I am," she said, "though we must be very quiet and unobtrusive. This is their ceremony, after all, and we are there by sufferance only." The convent cemetery lay behind the main building, enclosed by a high stone wall and shaded by ancient yew trees that must have predated the house itself. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry arrived just as the small procession was emerging from the chapel, led by the chaplain in his vestments, and followed by the sisters in their habits, walking 2 by 2 in perfect silence. Sister Agnes's coffin, carried by 4 pallbearers from the village, was of simple oak with no ornamentation beyond a plain brass plate bearing her name and the years of her life. The grave had been dug in the far corner of the cemetery, beneath one of the great yews, and the earth piled beside it was dark and rich. Mother Superior's expression, when she noticed the 2 uninvited mourners standing respectfully at a distance, registered something between resignation and faint disapproval, but she made no move to send them away, and the service proceeded with the quiet dignity that centuries of tradition had perfected. Miss Marple listened to the familiar words of committal, and watched as the coffin was lowered into the ground. But her attention was not entirely fixed on the ceremony itself. She found herself observing the other elements of the scene, the grave's position relative to the others in the cemetery, the way the fresh earth contrasted with the grass around it, the expressions on the faces of the sisters as they filed past to cast their handfuls of soil. It was only when the service concluded and the sisters began to disperse that Miss Marple noticed something that made her pause. The grave immediately adjacent to Sister Agnes's bore a simple stone marker, already weathered by time and darkened by rain. She moved closer, adjusting her spectacles to read the inscription, Sister Catherine Rose Blackwell, 1887 to 1955, at rest in the Lord. The nun who died in September, Lady Bantry murmured, having followed Miss Marple's gaze. The one whose date was changed in the register. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. How very convenient that Sister Agnes should be buried right beside her. Almost as if someone wished to keep them together, even in death. Mother Superior approached them as they stood before Sister Catherine's grave, her expression carefully neutral. Miss Marple, Lady Bantry, it was kind of you to come, though I did indicate that this was to be a private service. Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple said gently. We meant no disrespect. Lady Bantry felt that as Sister Agnes was once a daughter of this village, the village should be represented at her passing. I understand, though Sister Agnes ceased to be a daughter of the village when she became a bride of Christ. Her life belonged entirely to this community. Course, Miss Marple agreed. Though I notice she has been laid to rest beside Sister Catherine. Were they particularly close? Something flickered in Mother Superior's grey eyes, too quick to identify with certainty but suggestive of discomfort. They were sisters together for many years. It seemed fitting. Sisters in Christ, you mean? Naturally. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze moving from Sister Catherine's grave to the fresh earth now covering Sister Agnes. Tell me, Mother Superior, when Sister Catherine died in September, was her funeral conducted with similar haste? The question hung in the cool October air, polite but pointed. Mother Superior's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sister Catherine's circumstances were different. She had been ill for some time, and arrangements could be made in advance. Sister Agnes's death, while not unexpected, came more sudden. I see, and yet you managed to arrange everything in less than 4 days. Quite remarkable efficiency. We are accustomed to managing such matters, Miss Marple. Death is not unfamiliar in a community of elderly women. No, indeed. Though I must confess, I find it curious that Sister Agnes should have burned certain papers the night she died, spoken prayers aloud after years of silence, and then been buried with such extraordinary speed. It almost suggests that someone wished to ensure no further questions would be asked about her or her effects. Mother Superior drew herself up, her expression cooling. I'm not certain I appreciate your implication, Miss Marple. I'm making no implication, Miss Marple said mildly, merely an observation, though I do wonder what Sister Agnes might have told us, had she lived long enough to complete whatever task occupied her final hours. She turned away from the graves and began to walk slowly toward the cemetery gate, Lady Bantry following. But before they departed, Miss Marple paused and looked back at Mother Superior, who stood alone among the yew trees, her black habit blending into the shadows. Haste, Miss Marple said quietly, often belongs to the living, not the dead. And in my experience, those who hurry to close a chapter usually have good reason to fear what might be found if the book were left open a little longer. Chapter 5, Footprints Between the Cloister and the Gate. It was the convent gardener who first mentioned the footprints, though he did so quite innocently, and without any sense that the information might be significant. His name was Albert Jessup, and he attended the convent grounds for nearly 30 years, ever since a riding accident had left him with a pronounced limp and unsuited for the heavier work he had done on the farms around St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple encountered him quite by chance 2 days after the funeral, when she happened to be walking past the convent walls on her way to visit old Mrs. Pettigrew, who lived in one of the cottages that bordered the church lane. Mr. Jessup was trimming the hedge that separated the convent property from the public footpath, and he touched his cap respectfully when Miss Marple paused to admire a particularly fine climbing rose that still bore a few late blooms despite the advancing season. "You keep the gardens beautifully, Mr. Jessup," Miss Marple observed. "That rose must be very old." "Near about 50 years, Miss Marple. Sister Agnes herself planted it, back when she first came to the convent. She had a rare touch with roses, she did. Always said they needed talking to, same as people." Sister Agnes was a gardener, then? In her younger days, yes, before her hands got too stiff for the work. She'd still come out sometimes and just sit among the flowers, particularly in the autumn when the light was soft. Said it reminded her of something, though she never said what. Miss Marple noted this detail with the same quiet attention she gave to all such fragments of information, storing it away for later consideration. "You must miss her presence in the garden." Mr. Jessup's weathered face took on a thoughtful expression. "That I do, Miss Marple. Though truth be told, I hadn't seen much of her these past weeks. Not since Sister Catherine passed, anyhow. Sister Agnes seemed to withdraw into herself after that, like. Kept to her cell mostly, or so the other sisters said. They were close, I understand. Must have been, though they were different as chalk and cheese to my way of thinking. Sister Catherine was all warmth and chatter. Always had a kind word when she came through the garden. Sister Agnes was quiet, watchful, not unfriendly mind, but reserved, like she was always thinking about something she couldn't quite bring herself to say." He paused in his trimming and looked back toward the convent building, which rose grey and solid beyond its walls. "Peculiar thing happened the night she died. As it happens, I found footprints the next morning coming from the cloister door all the way to the outer gate and back again. Fresh they were, pressed into the frost." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her voice remained gently conversational. "Footprints in the frost. Aye, we had a hard frost that Friday night, first of the season. When I came in Saturday morning to check on the greenhouses, I noticed the mark straight away. Single set of prints going and coming, woman's shoes by the look of them, though I'm no expert in such matters. Could they have been Sister Agnes's?" Mr. Jessup shook his head decisively. "That's what struck me as odd, Miss Marple. Sister Agnes hadn't been outside in months, not since summer anyway. Her legs were too weak for walking any distance, and she felt the cold something terrible. Dr. Haydock had been quite firm about her staying indoors once the weather turned." "Then whose footprints were they?" "That I couldn't say. I mentioned it to Mother Superior when I saw her later that morning, thinking perhaps one of the sisters had been taken ill in the night and needed the doctor. But she said no one had left the building, and I wasn't to trouble myself about it." He resumed his trimming, but his movements had taken on a slightly uneasy quality, as if the memory still puzzled him. "Mind you, the prints went right up. Prints to the outer gate, the one that leads to the lane. And the gate itself wasn't properly latched when I checked it. Just pushed to, like someone had closed it in a hurry and hadn't waited to hear the latch catch." "How very curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And you're quite certain the footprints led both to the gate and back again?" "Certain as I stand here. I followed them myself, thinking perhaps some village person had got confused and wandered into the grounds by mistake. But they started at the cloister door, went straight to the gate, then back the same way. No wandering about, no hesitation. Like whoever it was knew exactly where they were going." "And the cloister door? Was it unlocked?" Mr. Jessup looked uncomfortable. "Well now, that's another odd thing. The cloister door is never locked from the inside, you understand. The sisters must be able to get out in case of fire or such emergency. But it's kept closed and strangers can't get in that way because it only opens outward. Yet when I checked it that morning thinking the wind might have blown it open, it was shut tight and proper." Miss Marple considered this information while appearing to give her full attention to the climbing rose. "So someone came from inside the convent, walked to the outer gate and returned. Someone wearing woman's shoes on a night when Sister Agnes died after praying aloud for the first time in decades. When you put it like that, Miss Marple, it does sound peculiar. Though Mother Superior said I wasn't to make anything of it, and I'm sure she knows best." "I'm sure she does," Miss Marple agreed gently. "Tell me, Mr. Jessup, did you notice anything else unusual that morning? Any other signs of disturbance?" The gardener frowned, thinking back. Nothing particular, though I did notice that the bench beside Sister Agnes's rose had been moved. Just a bit, you understand, maybe 6 inches from where it usually sat. I thought perhaps one of the sisters had shifted it to sweep beneath. But when I mentioned it to Sister Perpetua, she looked at me oddly and said no one had been near that part of the garden in days. The bench beside Sister Agnes's rose, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Was it moved closer to the building or further away? Closer, I'd say, as if someone had been sitting there and wanted to be nearer to the wall, or perhaps wanted to be less visible from the windows above. Miss Marple thanked Mr. Jessup for his time and continued on her way to Mrs. Pettigrew's cottage. But her mind was far from the basket of preserves she carried, or the social niceties that awaited her. Instead, she found herself constructing a picture of that Friday night, the frost settling over the garden, the cloister door opening silently, a solitary figure making its way to the outer gate and back again. But who had made that journey and why? Later that afternoon, when she had concluded her visit with Mrs. Pettigrew and returned home, Miss Marple sat down with a sheet of paper and began to make notes in her small, precise handwriting. It was a habit she had developed over the years, this practice of recording facts and observations before they could become confused by time or speculation. The footprints troubled her. If Sister Agnes had been too frail to leave her cell, then someone else had walked to the gate that night. But who? And had they been coming or going? The outline began to take shape. Sister Agnes dying after speaking prayers aloud, burning papers in her grate, and leaving her window unlatched. Mrs. Thornton visiting 3 days earlier, and leaving without satisfaction. Sister Catherine dying 6 weeks before, her death date altered in the register. Footprints leading to the outer gate and back again on the night Sister Agnes died. Each piece seemed unconnected to the others, yet Miss Marple's long experience had taught her that such disconnection was usually an illusion. Human behaviour followed patterns, and when those patterns seemed random, it was generally because one did not yet understand the principle that connected them. She was still contemplating these matters when her nephew Raymond returned from his walk, bringing with him a piece of information that he clearly considered trivial, but which caused Miss Marple to set down her pen with sudden interest. "I ran into Dr. Haydock in the village," Raymond said, warming his hands at the fire. "He mentioned that he had been called to the convent on the night Sister Agnes died, but not to attend to her. One of the younger nuns had fainted in the chapel during Compline. Nothing serious, apparently, just the heat and emotion of the service. But he thought it odd that Mother Superior should have telephoned for him, rather than simply having the girl lie down until she recovered." "Which young nun was it?" "I didn't ask. Does it matter?" "It might," Miss Marple said quietly. "Tell me, Raymond, did de Haydock say what time he was called?" "Around 11, I think he said. He was just preparing for bed when the telephone rang." "And how long did he stay at the convent?" Raymond shrugged. "He didn't specify. 20 minutes, perhaps? Just long enough to examine the girl and assure Mother Superior that there was nothing to worry about." Miss Marple rose and went to the window, looking out at the gathering dusk. So Dr. Haydock was at the convent around 11 o'clock on the night Sister Agnes died, and Sister Agnes was heard praying aloud near midnight, and sometime during those hours, someone walked from the cloister door to the outer gate and back again, leaving footprints in the frost. "You think there's a connection?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that when a doctor is summoned to attend a fainting girl on the same night that an elderly nun dies after burning papers and speaking prayers aloud, one must consider the possibility that the fainting was not entirely coincidental, particularly if it provided an excuse for the doctor to be present at the convent during hours when he might otherwise have been at home in bed." "You're suggesting the fainting was deliberate?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said, turning from the window, "that young women don't usually faint during Compline unless something has occurred to disturb them greatly, and I'm wondering whether that something might have had to do with Sister Agnes and with whoever came to see her that night." She returned to her chair and picked up her pen once more, adding a new line to her notes. Who came to the gate, and what did Sister Agnes give them, or tell them, that required she first burn all evidence of it? Chapter 6. Miss Marple examines a burned scrap. The opportunity to examine Sister Agnes's cell more thoroughly came about quite unexpectedly through the agency of Lady Bantry's persistence and Mother Superior's evident desire to put an end to what she clearly viewed as unseemly speculation. "If it will satisfy your curiosity, Miss Marple," Mother Superior had said when Lady Bantry arrived at the convent on Thursday morning with a direct request that her friend be permitted to view the deceased nun's effects, "you may examine what little remains, though I must tell you that Sister Perpetua has already prepared the cell for its next occupant, and anything of a personal nature has been set aside for disposal or, where appropriate, preservation in our archives." Miss Marple had been summoned from her cottage within the hour, and now found herself once again in the austere chamber where Sister Agnes had spent the last decades of her life. The room was indeed ready for new occupation, the bed freshly made with crisp linen, the desk bare except for a plain wooden crucifix, the grate swept clean of all but the faintest trace of ash, or so it appeared at first glance. Miss Marple stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the scene with the same careful attention she had given it on her previous visit. Sister Perpetua hovered nearby, her ink-stained fingers clasped together in an attitude of patient forbearance, while Mother Superior waited with the sort of dignified resignation that suggested she was humouring an elderly woman's whims, but expected nothing to come of it. "The ash pan," Miss Marple said quietly. "Has it been emptied?" Sister Perpetua looked surprised. "Why no, Miss Marple, I swept out the grate, naturally, but the ash pan beneath hasn't been touched. There seemed no reason to disturb it, as we shan't be lighting fires in this room until the new occupant arrives. Might I examine it?" Permission was granted with a slight inclination of Mother Superior's head, and Miss Marple knelt beside the fireplace with a care that betrayed the stiffness in her knees. The ashpan was a simple iron tray that slid out from beneath the grate, designed to catch the fine ash that fell through the bars during burning. Sister Perpetua had swept the larger pieces of ash from the grate itself, but the pan still held a delicate layer of grey powder, undisturbed since the night of Sister Agnes's death. Miss Marple drew a clean handkerchief from her handbag and spread it on the floor beside her. Then, with fingers that were remarkably steady despite her years, she began to sift through the ash with a delicacy that would have done credit to an archaeologist examining ancient pottery shards. "What exactly are you looking for?" Mother Superior asked, her tone suggesting she expected no sensible answer. "I'm not entirely certain," Miss Marple admitted, "but I've found over the years that when people burn papers, they often do so incompletely. A scrap missed, a corner that failed to catch fire, a fragment fell through the grate before it could be fully consumed." Her fingers paused over a small irregularity in the ash, a texture that differed from the fine powder around it. With infinite care she lifted out a fragment no larger than her thumbnail, its edges charred black but its centre still bearing the ghost of what had once been printed there. "I believe I've found something," she said softly. Sister Perpetua and Mother Superior both leaned forward, their earlier scepticism giving way to genuine interest. Miss Marple placed the fragment on her handkerchief and angled it toward the light from the narrow window. The scrap was thick paper, heavier than ordinary writing stock, and its partial survival suggested it had been part of an envelope or folder that had fallen through the grate early in the burning process. What remained visible was tantalizing in its incompleteness, the curve of what might have been an ornate letter, embossed rather than printed, and beside it the faint remnant of a circular design. "It's part of a seal," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to her audience. "An official seal of some kind." Mother Superior's expression had grown guarded. "Many documents bear seals, Miss Marple. It could be anything." "Indeed it could, though the embossing suggests a certain formality. Not a personal letter, I think, but something more official. A certificate, perhaps, or a legal document." She turned the fragment carefully, examining it from different angles in the light. The circular design was clearer now, and she could just make out what appeared to be a building or structure within the border of the seal, though whether it was a church, a manor house, or some other edifice was impossible to determine from so small a remnant. "Might I borrow this?" Miss Marple asked. "I should like to examine it more closely at home, where the light is better and I have my reading. Glass." Mother Superior hesitated, then nodded. "If you believe it significant, though I cannot imagine what an old piece of burned paper might tell you about Sister Agnes's death, which Dr. Haydock has already certified as entirely natural." "Perhaps nothing," Miss Marple agreed, wrapping the fragment carefully in her handkerchief and placing it in her handbag. "Though I confess myself curious about what Sister Agnes felt necessary to burn so thoroughly. If it were merely old correspondence or personal papers of no consequence, why not simply discard them? Burning suggests a desire to ensure complete destruction, does it not?" She rose from her kneeling position with Sister Perpetua's assistance and brushed the ash from her skirt. "Tell me, Mother Superior, did Sister Agnes receive any official documents in recent months? Anything that might have borne such a seal?" "Sister Agnes received no correspondence whatsoever, as I've already mentioned. She had no family, no connection to the outside world. If she possessed any documents bearing official seals, they must have been very old indeed, perhaps brought with her when she first entered the convent." 40 years ago, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "That would be 15, I believe you said." "Yes, though she did not take her final vows until 1917. The war years were difficult for everyone, and many postulants required additional time for discernment." Miss Marple had moved to the window and was examining the latch once more, running her fingers over the iron mechanism with the same careful attention she had given to the ashpan. "And during those 2 years, between 1915 and 1917, did Sister Agnes leave the convent at all? To visit family, perhaps? Or to attend to matters in the outside world?" Sister Perpetua answered before Mother Superior could speak. "I know she did, Miss Marple, because I've seen the old records. In the winter of 1916, Sister Agnes received permission to attend a funeral in the village. The records note it specifically because it was so unusual. Postulants were generally discouraged from returning to their former lives, even for such occasions." "A funeral?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Do the records indicate whose funeral it was?" "I'm afraid not. Just that permission was granted for her to attend a burial service, and that she returned to the convent the same evening." Mother Superior's expression had taken on a quality that Miss Marple recognised from long experience, the look of someone who has suddenly perceived connections they would prefer to remain unexamined. "I failed to see what relevance a funeral from nearly 40 years ago could have to Sister Agnes's death last week," Mother Superior said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps none," Miss Marple said gently, "though it does seem curious, does it not, that someone who attended a funeral in 1916 should, in 1955, burn papers and speak prayers for the departed before dying in the night. Funerals and prayers for the dead have a way of connecting across time, particularly when there are matters of conscience involved." She turned from the window and regarded Mother Superior with a directness that was entirely kind but quite implacable. "I wonder, Mother Superior, whether you might permit me to examine those old records Sister Agnes requested shortly before her death. The registers from the 1930s, I believe you mentioned. I've already had them brought to the parlour, as I promised, though I cannot imagine what you hope to find there." "Neither can I," Miss Marple admitted, "but I have a feeling that Sister Agnes found something that troubled her enough to request a visit from Mrs. Thornton, and that troubled Mrs. Thornton enough to leave without satisfaction. Something perhaps that related to a burial held long ago, recorded in documents that bore official seals. That afternoon, in Miss Marple's sitting room, the burned fragment lay on a white plate where the light from the window could illuminate it properly. Miss Marple had fetched her strongest reading glass and was examining the scrap with the focused attention of a jeweller, assessing a doubtful stone. Lady Bantry, who had been summoned to provide a second opinion, peered over her friend's shoulder with frank curiosity. "Can you make anything of it, Jane?" "I believe so. This portion here, do you see? is part of a church tower, or I'm very much mistaken. And these letters, though badly damaged, appear to be initials of some kind. S and M, possibly, though the M might be an N. St. Mary's? Our church? Or St. Mary Mead itself? Many official village documents bore the church seal in earlier times. Birth certificates, burial permits, records of the burial committee. Lady Bantry straightened abruptly. The burial committee? Jane, do you remember when they used to issue permits for burials in the churchyard? Before the war, certainly, but I think the practice continued well into the 20s. I remember very well. My father served on the committee for a time. They used very particular stationery, heavy cream paper with the village seal embossed at the top, and each permit was signed by at least 2 committee members to prevent irregularities. So this could be a fragment of a burial permit. It could, Miss Marple said slowly, though why Sister Agnes should have possessed such a document, and why she should have felt compelled to burn it 40 years after the fact, I cannot yet say. She set down her reading glass and looked at her friend with an expression that combined determination with a certain sadness. But I believe, Dolly, that we are beginning to approach the heart of this matter. Sister Agnes burned a burial permit, or something very like it, on the night she died, and 3 days before that, she received a visit from a woman who left without satisfaction, and 6 weeks before that, Sister Catherine died and had her death date altered in the register. You think it's all connected to a burial? I think, Miss Marple said quietly, that burials matter very much when they involve irregularities, and I think Sister Agnes knew something about a burial that took place long ago, something that has troubled her conscience for decades, something she tried in her final hours to set right. Chapter 7. The Night the Snow Fell Early. The village records were kept in a somewhat haphazard fashion in the vestry of St. Mary Mead Church, a small stone room that smelled of old paper, candle wax, and the particular mustiness that accumulates in places where dust is considered reverent rather than negligent. Miss Marple had obtained permission to examine them through the good offices of the vicar, Mr. Clement, who had known her long enough to understand that when she expressed interest in historical documents, she usually had excellent reasons for doing so. I'm afraid our record-keeping has been rather variable over the years, Mr. Clement said apologetically, unlocking a large oak cupboard that stood against the vestry wall. The previous vicar was meticulous, bless him, but his predecessor rather let things slide. Still, the burial registers should be complete. The church takes such matters very seriously. He pulled out several leather-bound volumes and set them on the vestry table, raising small clouds of dust that danced in the thin November sunlight filtering through the narrow window. What period are you interested in, Miss Marple? The year's around 1916, I think, though I may need to look at the records from the 1930s as well, if that wouldn't be too much trouble. Mr. Clement's eyebrows rose slightly, but he asked no questions. One of his many virtues, Miss Marple reflected, was his understanding that elderly ladies of the parish sometimes had excellent reasons for pursuing lines of inquiry that might seem obscure to others. I'll leave you to it then. I have a sermon to prepare, but do call if you need anything. When she was alone, Miss Marple opened the first volume and began to read. The entries were recorded in various hands, some elegant and careful, others barely legible. Each burial was noted with the deceased's name, age, date of death, cause when known, and the date of interment. In some cases, additional notes had been added: beloved wife, late of London, no known relations. She found what she was looking for in the register for December 1916. The entry was written in a hand that trembled slightly, as if the writer had been either very old or very upset. Eleanor Mary Cunningham, aged 19 years, died 14th of December 1916. Cause, fever, Airy 16th December 1916. Committee present, J. Whitmore, T. Blackwell. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her mind working rapidly. Cunningham had been Sister Agnes's surname before she entered the convent. Eleanor Mary Cunningham, aged 19, dying in December 1916. The timing aligned perfectly with Sister Agnes receiving permission to attend a funeral that winter. But it was the additional notation, written in a different hand and clearly added later, that arrested Miss Marple's attention. Weather, heavy snow from evening of 14th, ground frozen. She turned to the village weather diary, another volume that Mr. Clement had thoughtfully provided. It was a record, kept by successive vicars and their wives, noting each day's weather as faithfully as the tides. Some entries were perfunctory: rain, fine, or overcast, while others were more expansive, particularly when the weather had been noteworthy. The entry for December 14th, 1916 was quite detailed. Heavy snow began falling at approximately upon o'clock this evening. By midnight, accumulation of 4 inches. Temperature well below freezing. Road to the village impassable. And the next day, snow continued through morning. Cleared by noon. Ground frozen solid. Difficult conditions persist. Miss Marple turned back to the burial register and read the entry again, more carefully this time. Eleanor Cunningham had died on the evening of December the 14th. When heavy snow had already begun to fall, she had been buried on December the 16th, 2 days later, when the ground was frozen solid. Yet the cause of death was listed as fever. Miss Marple knew enough of village life to understand what fever had often meant in those days, particularly for young unmarried women. It was a convenient euphemism, a way of maintaining respectability when the actual circumstances might prove embarrassing to the family. But it was the timing that troubled her now. If Eleanor had died of fever, why the delay in burial? In winter, with no means of preservation, bodies were usually interred quickly, unless there had been some difficulty about the death itself, some question that needed to be resolved before the burial could proceed. She rose and went to the window, looking out at the churchyard where generations of St. Mary Mead's residents lay beneath their weathered stones. Somewhere among them, if the register was accurate, lay Eleanor Mary Cunningham, dead at 19 in the winter of 1916. But was she alone? The question had formed itself unbidden in Miss Marple's mind, but once there it refused to be dislodged. Young women did not usually die of fever in the middle of winter unless they had been weakened by something else. And if Eleanor had died in childbirth, as fever might well have disguised, then what had become of the child? She returned to the table and examined the burial register more closely, looking at the names of the committee members who'd been present: J. Whitmore and T. Blackwell. The latter name gave her pause. Blackwell. Sister Catherine's surname had been Blackwell. Miss Marple turned to the 1930s registers that Mr. Clement had also provided, searching for any other Blackwells who might have been buried in St. Mary Mead. She found 2 entries. Thomas Blackwell, aged 67 years, died the 3rd of March 1937, cause heart failure, burial committee member 1910 to 1935, and much later, Sarah Blackwell, aged some 1 years, died 18th November 1938, cause pneumonia. The entries were unremarkable in themselves, but Miss Marple noted that Thomas Blackwell had served on the burial committee for 25 years, including the year of Eleanor Cunningham's death, and his wife Sarah had died of pneumonia, just as Sister Catherine had died of pneumonia in September of 1955. She was still contemplating these connections when Mr. Clement returned, carrying a tea tray that he set down with an apologetic smile. "I thought you might appreciate some refreshment. You've been at it for quite some time." "How very kind." Miss Marple accepted a cup gratefully. "Mr. Clement, do you recall anyone in the village named Blackwell? Apart from Sister Catherine at the convent, I mean." The vicar considered the question while pouring his own tea. "The name isn't familiar from recent years, I'm afraid, though I believe there were Blackwells here in the past. My predecessor mentioned them once or twice. Respectable family, I gathered, though they seem to have died out or moved away before my time." "Thomas Blackwell served on the burial committee for many years." "Ah, yes. The committee was rather different in those days. It had certain administrative responsibilities that have since been transferred to the parish council. They approved burial permits, ensured the sexton's work was properly done, that sort of thing. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Would the committee have had any authority over the recording of causes of death? Mr. Clement looked surprised. Not officially, no. That would be the doctor's responsibility. Though I suppose if there were any questions about a death, the committee might have been consulted. They were prominent men in the village, after all, and in those days such matters were often handled with a degree of discretion that might seem unusual today. Discretion, Miss Marple repeated softly. Yes, I imagine a great deal of discretion was exercised in cases where the actual circumstances might prove awkward. She finished her tea and began to gather her things, thanking Mr. Clement for his assistance. But before she left the vestry, she paused at the door and looked back at the volumes, spread on the table. Tell me, Mr. Clement, in your experience, have you ever known ground to be soft and easily dug when there has been heavy snow and freezing temperatures? The vicar blinked at this unexpected question. Soft ground after a freeze? No, certainly not. Once the ground freezes, it becomes quite hard. Impossible to dig without considerable effort. Or so I've been told by the sexton. Precisely what I thought. Thank you, Mr. Clement. You've been most helpful. She walked home through the November afternoon, her mind turning over what she had discovered. Eleanor Cunningham had died on a night of heavy snow and freezing temperatures. She had been buried 2 days later, when the ground was frozen solid, and yet someone had managed to dig her grave and into her body with sufficient haste that the burial could be completed within 48 hours. Either the ground had not been as frozen as the weather record suggested, or the grave had been prepared before Eleanor died. Neither possibility was comforting. When she reached her cottage, Miss Marple found Lady Bantry waiting for her, pacing the sitting room with barely contained impatience. "Jane, where have you been? I've been here for simply ages. I've discovered something rather important." "As have I," Miss Marple said, removing her hat and gloves. "But you first, Dolly, what have you learned?" "I've been talking to old Mrs. Henderson again, asking about the Cunningham family. She remembers this quite clearly now that her memory has been jogged. There were 2 daughters, just as we thought. Eleanor was the elder, and apparently she was considered rather flighty. Got herself into some sort of trouble during the war, Mrs. Henderson said, though she wouldn't be specific about the details. The other daughter was called Agnes." "Sister Agnes," Miss Marple murmured. "Exactly. Mrs. Henderson said Agnes was the quiet one, very devoted to her sister. When Eleanor died, Agnes was absolutely devastated. She entered the convent shortly afterward, and the family moved away within the year. Mrs. Henderson always thought it was grief that drove Agnes to take vows, but now I wonder if there was more to it than that." Miss Marple settled into her chair, her expression grave. "There was indeed more to it, Dolly. Eleanor Cunningham died on December the 14th, 1916, during a heavy snowfall. She was buried 2 days later, supposedly of fever, in ground that should have been frozen solid, and one of the burial committee members present was Thomas Blackwell. Sister Catherine's relation. Almost certainly her father. And I believe, Dolly, that Sister Agnes has been carrying a secret about her sister's death for nearly 40 years, a secret that involved the Blackwell family, a burial that was conducted with unseemly haste, and a cause of death that may not have been entirely accurate." Lady Bantry sat down slowly. "You think Eleanor's death was irregular in some way?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Eleanor Cunningham's burial was irregular, and I think Sister Agnes knew it and Sister Catherine knew it. And when Sister Catherine died, something prompted Sister Agnes to try at last to set the record straight." Chapter 8. A grave that should have been frozen. The following morning brought a frost sharp enough to etch patterns on the windows and turn the grass white and crisp underfoot. Miss Marple, dressed warmly against the cold, made her way to St. Mary Mead churchyard with a sense of purpose that overrode the protests of her rheumatic knees. She had telephoned ahead to Mr. Sims, the sexton, asking if he might meet her among the graves. He was a taciturn man of 60-odd years who had tended the churchyard for 3 decades and knew the location of every burial as intimately as a librarian knows his shelves. When Miss Marple arrived, she found him leaning on his spade near the lich gate, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. "Morning, Miss Marple. You said you wanted to see one of the old graves." "If it's not too much trouble, Mr. Sims, I'm looking for the burial place of Eleanor Cunningham. She died in 1916, I believe." The sexton's weathered face showed no particular reaction to the name, but he nodded and gestured for her to follow him along the path that wound between the headstones. They passed the newer graves near the church, where the stones still stood upright and the inscriptions were clear, and continued toward the older section where time and weather had softened the edges of everything. "Cunningham, you said? That'll be over here if memory serves." He led her to a corner of the churchyard that was partially shaded by an ancient yew, its branches spreading wide enough to keep the ground beneath relatively clear of grass. There, among several other modest headstones, stood a simple marker of grey stone that had weathered to almost the same colour as the tree bark behind it. Eleanor. Mary Cunningham. Beloved daughter. 1897. 1916. At peace. "This is the one?" Miss Marple asked, though she could see plainly that it was. "Aye, not much to it, as you can see. Family didn't have money for anything grand, and with the war on, even simple stones were hard to come by." Miss Marple studied the grave with careful attention. It lay in a line with 2 others, all from approximately the same period, but something about its position struck her as slightly irregular. The headstone was set back a fraction further than its neighbours, as if whoever had placed it had needed a bit more room. "Mr. Sims, you've been sexton here for 30 years, you said. I don't suppose you would remember who dug this particular grave?" "Before my time, I'm afraid. That would have been old Amos Fletcher, my predecessor. He's been gone these 15 years now." "Did he leave any records? Notes about the graves he prepared?" Mr. Sims scratched his chin thoughtfully. "He kept a sort of ledger, now you mention it. Noted which graves he'd dug and when, so as to remember where he could dig again without disturbing anything. It's in the vestry, I believe, though I haven't looked at it in years." "Might we retrieve it?" 20 minutes later they were back, in the vestry where Miss Marple had conducted her research the previous day. Mr. Sims had unearthed a battered notebook from the cupboard, its pages yellowed and spotted with damp, but its entries still legible in a careful, laborious hand. Miss Marple turned to December 1916 and found the entry she sought. Eleanor Cunningham. Grave dug, 15. Descent. Deep plot, 7 feet. Ground hard but not frozen through. Committee requested extra depth. TB in attendance. 7 feet, Miss Marple murmured. "That's deeper than usual, isn't it?" Mr. Sims peered over her shoulder at the notation. "A fair bit deeper, yes. Standard depth is 6 feet, sometimes less in difficult ground. 7 feet would take considerable extra work, particularly in December." And the note about the ground being hard but not frozen through. What would that mean? The sexton frowned. Odd thing to note, that. If the ground was hard, it would make digging difficult. But if it wasn't frozen solid, it could still be done with enough effort, though you'd expect it to be frozen in mid-December, especially after heavy snow. Unless the grave had been prepared earlier, Miss Marple suggested quietly, before the ground froze. Mr. Sims' frown deepened. That would be irregular, Miss Marple. Graves aren't usually dug before they're needed. It's not proper, for one thing, and for another, an open grave is dangerous. Someone might fall in. But it could be done if the burial committee requested it. I suppose so, though I've never heard of such a thing. The committee had authority in those days, and if they had reason to prepare a grave in advance, old Amos would have followed their instructions. Miss Marple thanked Mr. Sims and asked if she might keep the notebook for a day or two, promising to return it carefully. He agreed with the sort of resigned acceptance that suggested he had learned not to question the peculiar requests of elderly ladies who seemed to know what they were about. Walking back through the churchyard, Miss Marple paused once more at Eleanor Cunningham's grave. The frost made everything sharply visible, each blade of grass standing out with particular clarity. And it was this clarity that allowed her to notice something she had missed before, a slight depression in the ground just beyond the headstone, as if the earth there had settled more than it should have after nearly 40 years. She stood looking at that depression for a long moment, her mind working through the implications. A grave dug to 7 feet instead of the usual 6. Ground noted as hard but not frozen, despite heavy snow and freezing temperatures. A burial conducted with unusual haste, only 2 days after death, and a cause of death listed as fever, when fever alone would not usually require such expedition. The pattern was beginning to emerge with uncomfortable clarity. That afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Lady Bantry arrived in a state of excitement, accompanied by a woman Miss Marple had never seen before. She was perhaps 50, respectably dressed in dark clothing that suggested mourning, with a face that bore the lines of long worry and recent grief. "Jane, this is Mrs. Thornton," Lady Bantry announced, "the woman who visited Sister Agnes shortly before her death. She came to Gossington this morning asking if I knew how to find you. I thought you'd want to speak with her directly." Miss Marple invited them both to sit and offered tea, which Mrs. Thornton accepted with hands that trembled slightly as she raised the cup. "I understand you wish to speak with me, Mrs. Thornton, about Sister Agnes, perhaps." The woman set down her cup carefully, as if fearing she might spill it. "I don't know if I should be here at all, Miss Marple. Lady Bantry said you were asking questions about Sister Agnes's death, and I thought perhaps I should tell you what I know, though it's a painful matter, and one I'm not certain I understand fully myself." "Please, take your time. Anything you can tell me may be helpful." Mrs. Thornton drew a breath that seemed to steady her. "My mother died 3 weeks ago. She was 73 and her mind had been failing for some time, but before she died, she became quite agitated about something. She kept talking about a baby and a terrible mistake, and how she needed to tell the truth before it was too late." "Your mother's name?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Sarah Blackwell. She was Sister Catherine's sister-in-law. My father was Thomas Blackwell, who served on the village burial committee before the war." Miss Marple's expression remained carefully neutral, but Lady Bantry could not suppress a small gasp of understanding. "Your mother knew something about Eleanor Cunningham's death," Miss Marple said. It was not a question. Mrs. Thornton nodded miserably. "I didn't understand it at first. Mother's mind wandered so much in those final weeks, but she kept insisting that I must find Sister Agnes and tell her that the child had survived, that someone had taken it away but it had lived. She said Sister Agnes had a right to know after all these years." "What child, Mrs. Thornton?" "Eleanor Cunningham's baby. Mother said Eleanor had died in childbirth, not of fever as the record showed. The baby was born alive, but there was no father to claim it, and the family was desperate to avoid scandal. My father was on the burial committee, and he arranged for the death certificate to say fever, and my Aunt Catherine, who was just entering the convent then, helped care for the baby until arrangements could be made. The room was very quiet. Even the fire seemed to burn more softly, as if reluctant to disturb the weight of these revelations." "And what happened to the baby?" Miss Marple asked. "It was sent away, adopted by a family in another county. Mother didn't know the details, and I don't think she wanted to, but she said Sister Agnes never knew the child had lived. She thought the baby had died with Eleanor, and she entered the convent believing she had lost both her sister and her sister's child on the same night." Mrs. Thornton's eyes filled with tears. "When I went to see Sister Agnes, I tried to tell her what my mother had said, but she became so distressed. She said it couldn't be true, that the burial record showed only one death. She said if the baby had lived, there would have been some record of it, some proof." And what did you say?" I told her that perhaps the records had been altered, or perhaps some documents had been destroyed to protect the family's reputation. But she wouldn't believe me. She kept saying that her sister's grave was all she had left, and that I was asking her to doubt everything she'd believed for 40 years. She asked me to leave, and I did. I thought perhaps she needed time to think about it. Miss Marple rose and went to her desk, returning with the small fragment of burned paper she'd recovered. From Sister Agnes's cell, she showed it to Mrs. Thornton. "I believe Sister Agnes did think about what you told her, and I believe she began to search for the truth. This fragment is all that remains of what I suspect was a burial permit, one that may have contained information about what really happened the night Eleanor died. Sister Agnes burned it the night she died, but I don't think she burned it to conceal the truth. I think she burned it because she had finally learned what she needed to know, and she wanted to ensure that certain painful details would not survive her. You think she discovered that my mother was telling the truth?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that Sister Agnes examined the old records, perhaps with Sister Catherine's help before she died, and I think she discovered that the grave where her sister lies may contain more than one person, or possibly that it contained someone other than who the headstone claims." Chapter 9. Alibis at Compline Hour. The following morning, Miss Marple requested another interview with Mother Superior, this time accompanied by Mrs. Thornton. Lady Bantry had offered to come as well, but Miss Marple gently suggested that perhaps a smaller group would be more conducive to frank conversation. There were matters of conscience to be discussed, and such discussions were often easier when conducted without an audience. They met in the convent parlour, that same quiet room where Miss Marple had first been received. Mother Superior's expression, when she entered and saw Mrs. Thornton seated beside Miss Marple, suggested she had anticipated this meeting and was not entirely pleased by the prospect. "Mrs. Thornton," Mother Superior said with careful courtesy, "I had not expected to see you again." "I felt it necessary to return, Mother Superior. There are things that need to be said, and questions that deserve answers." Mother Superior seated herself with the sort of composed dignity that suggested long practice in maintaining equanimity under trying circumstances. "I'm not certain what questions you believe I can answer. Sister Agnes's death was entirely natural, as Sir Haydock certified." "I'm not questioning the cause of Sister Agnes's death," Miss Marple said gently, "but I am curious about certain events on the night she died, particularly what occurred during Compline. Compline was conducted as usual. The entire community was present, including Sister Agnes." Mother Superior hesitated for the briefest moment. "Sister Agnes attended, yes, though she left before the service concluded. She was not feeling well. And Sister Perpetua? I believe she fainted during the service." "Sister Perpetua experienced a momentary weakness. It was nothing serious." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her fingers tracing a pattern on the arm of her chair. "How very convenient that de Haydock should have been summoned at precisely the time when Sister Agnes needed to speak with someone from outside the convent, someone who could walk to the outer gate without attracting undue attention." Mother Superior's grey eyes widened slightly. "I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning." "I think you do, Mother Superior. The footprints that Mr. Jessup found in the frost were not made by Sister Agnes, who was too frail to leave her cell, nor were they made by Sister Perpetua, who was supposedly unconscious in the chapel. They were made by someone who left the convent during Compline, when all the other sisters were occupied, and who needed a legitimate reason to have de Haydock present in case anyone questioned the late-night activity." Mrs. Thornton leaned forward. "Are you saying Sister Perpetua's fainting was deliberate?" "I'm saying that it provided an excellent excuse for having de Haydock at the convent at the very hour when Sister Agnes needed privacy to meet with someone. Whether Sister Perpetua fainted of her own accord or was asked to create a diversion I cannot say, but the timing was remarkably fortuitous." Mother Superior's hands, which had been folded calmly in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're making serious accusations, Miss Marple." "I am making observations," Miss Marple corrected gently. Sister Agnes received Mrs. Thornton's visit and learned that her sister's child had survived. This knowledge troubled her greatly, I imagine. She had spent 40 years believing that both Eleanor and the baby had died on the same night. Learning the truth would have been devastating. It was devastating, Mrs. Thornton said quietly. I could see it in her face when I told her. She looked as if I had struck her. Miss Marple continued, her voice remaining calm and measured. After Mrs. Thornton left, Sister Agnes began to search for proof. She requested the old registers, examined records from the 30s and earlier, and I believe she discovered something that confirmed Mrs. Thornton's account. Perhaps Sister Catherine helped her before she died. Perhaps the two of them worked together to uncover the truth. Mother Superior rose abruptly and moved to the window, her back to them. When she spoke, her voice was strained. Sister Catherine came to me shortly before she died. She was gravely ill and knew her time was limited. She asked me to promise that I would help Sister Agnes if she requested access to the old records. She said there was a matter of conscience that needed to be addressed. And you agreed? I saw no reason not to. Sister Catherine had served our community faithfully for decades. If she felt something needed to be resolved, I was willing to trust her judgment. But when Sister Agnes began her investigation, you became concerned. Mother Superior turned to face them, and for the first time her composure showed signs of strain. I became concerned when Sister Agnes began talking about correcting the burial records. She wanted to amend her sister's death certificate to show the true cause of death. She wanted to find out what had become of the child. She was prepared to expose a scandal that had been buried for 40 years, regardless of the consequences. And you advised against it? I counselled patience and prayer. I reminded her that her sister had been at peace for nearly 4 decades, and that disturbing that peace might cause more harm than good. But Sister Agnes was determined. She said truth mattered more than discretion, and that the child, if it still lived, had a right to know its history. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. So on the night she died, Sister Agnes arranged to meet with someone who could help her locate the child, or at least provide information about what had happened to it. How could you possibly know that? Mother Superior asked. Because someone walked from the cloister door to the outer gate and back again that night. Someone met another person at the gate, perhaps to receive documents or information. And Sister Agnes, knowing this meeting needed to occur in secret, arranged for a distraction. To Haydock's presence in the convent, attending to Sister Perpetua's convenient fainting spell, ensured that no one would notice one sister leaving briefly during Compline. Mrs. Thornton's face had gone pale. You're saying Sister Agnes arranged all of this before she died? I'm saying that Sister Agnes was a woman who had spent 40 years in a community governed by rules and schedules. She knew precisely when everyone would be occupied, and she knew how to arrange matters so that what needed to happen could happen without interference. Mother Superior returned to her chair, her movements weary. You're correct, Miss Marple. Sister Agnes did arrange it all. She asked Sister Perpetua to feign illness during Compline, so that de Haydock would be summoned. She asked me to walk to the outer gate to meet someone who had information about Eleanor's child. You were the one who made the footprints, Miss Marple said. It was not a question. Yes, Sister Agnes had been corresponding secretly with an agency that handled adoptions in the 1920s and 30s. Through them, she had learned that Eleanor's child had been placed with a family in Dorset. The agency sent a representative to meet with me that night, to provide documentation of the adoption. Sister Agnes wanted proof, you see. She wanted to know for certain that the child had lived and been cared for. And did you receive this proof? Mother Superior nodded slowly. I did. The representative gave me a sealed envelope containing copies of the adoption records. I brought it back to Sister Agnes in her cell. She opened it in my presence, read the documents, and then asked me to leave her alone for a time. That was when she burned the burial permit, Miss Marple said. The one that had falsely recorded Eleanor's cause of death. Yes, she said she no longer needed it now that she had proof of the truth. She burned it along with some other papers. Letters, I think, that she had kept hidden for decades. Documents that might have exposed the scandal if they had been discovered. Mrs. Thornton's voice was barely above a whisper. Did the adoption records say who took the child? Did Sister Agnes learn what became of Eleanor's baby? Mother Superior met her gaze directly. The child was adopted by a couple named Thornton, a respectable family who had been unable to have children of their own. They raised the child as their daughter and told her she was adopted when she came of age, though they never revealed the identity of her birth mother. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Mrs. Thornton sat perfectly still, her face drained of colour, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "The child was me," she said at last. "Eleanor Cunningham was my mother." Mother Superior inclined her head. "Sister Agnes realised the truth when you came to visit her. You told her your mother had been Sarah Blackwell, and that your father was Thomas Blackwell, but you also mentioned you were adopted." Sister Agnes saw the resemblance immediately. "You have Eleanor's eyes, apparently, and the same way of holding your head when you're troubled. But she couldn't bring herself to tell you, not until she had proof. So she arranged all of this, the investigation, the meeting at the gate, obtaining the records, so that she could be certain before she spoke to me again." "She asked me to write to you," Mother Superior said quietly. "She wanted you to come back after she had seen the documentation. She wanted to tell you herself, to explain everything. But her heart failed before the letter could be sent. She died that same night, just hours after learning the truth for certain." Miss Marple spoke gently into the heavy silence. "And the prayer she spoke aloud. Sister Clare said it was a prayer for the departed." "It was a prayer for Eleanor," Mother Superior confirmed. "Sister Agnes spoke it aloud because she wanted someone to hear. She wanted it witnessed that she had finally made her peace with her sister's death, now that she knew Eleanor's child had lived and been loved. The prayer was both a farewell and a thanksgiving." Mrs. Thornton's eyes were filled with tears. "She died before she could tell me, before I could know that she was my aunt, and that she'd been searching for me all along. She died knowing you existed," Miss Marple said softly. "And she died knowing that Eleanor's child had been raised in a good family, with kindness and care. Sometimes, Mrs. Thornton, that knowledge is enough. It was enough for Sister Agnes." Mother Superior rose and went to her desk, returning with a small envelope. "Sister Agnes left this for you. She gave it to me before Compline on the night she died, and asked me to ensure you received it if anything should happen to her. I think somehow she knew her time was very short." Mrs. Thornton took the envelope with trembling hands and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in the same precise handwriting Miss Marple had seen in the convent registers. She read it silently, tears streaming down her face. When she finished, she handed it to Miss Marple, who read it with gentle care. "My dear child, if you are reading this, then I have gone to join your mother into eternal rest. Know that you were loved, even before you were born, and that your mother's last thoughts were of you. I am sorry I could not tell you this in person, but I am grateful beyond words to know that you lived, and that you have had a good life. May God bless you always. Your aunt, Agnes Mary Cunningham." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and returned it to Mrs. Thornton, who clutched it to her heart as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you," Mrs. Thornton whispered. "Thank you for finding the truth." "The truth," Miss Marple said gently, "was there all along. Sister Agnes simply needed time to uncover it and courage to accept it. She had both in the end." Chapter 10. The Truth Sister, Agnes carried. A week later, on a grey November afternoon when the light seemed to fade almost before it had properly begun, Miss Marple sat in her familiar sitting room with Lady Bantry, reviewing the events that had so recently disturbed the quiet of St. Mary Mead. The fire burned brightly in the grate, and Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm as she worked on what had now become a christening shawl rather than a bed jacket. Lady Bantry had remarked that a change of purpose seemed fitting, given the circumstances, and Miss Marple had agreed with a small smile. "I still find it extraordinary," Lady Bantry said, pouring herself a second cup of tea, "that Mrs. Thornton should have been Eleanor's daughter all along. Imagine living your entire life not knowing such a thing and then discovering it in such a manner." "Life is full of such ironies," Miss Marple observed. "Though I suspect that some part of Sarah Blackwell's conscience must have troubled her for years. Why else would she have felt compelled to tell her daughter the truth on her deathbed? Secrets have a way of demanding to be spoken, particularly when one approaches the end. And Sister Agnes carried that secret for 40 years, believing her sister's child had died. Not quite believing, perhaps. I think Sister Agnes always wondered. That's why she entered the convent so quickly after Eleanor's death, and why she never spoke of her former life. The not knowing must have been torment enough, but the possibility that the child might have survived and been sent away without her knowledge would have been unbearable." Lady Bantry set down her cup with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Sister Catherine knew all along?" "I believe Sister Catherine knew that Eleanor had died in childbirth rather than of fever. Her father was on the burial committee, after all, and her Aunt Sarah was one of those who helped arrange the adoption, but I don't think she knew the full extent of what had been concealed until much later. Perhaps not until she herself was dying and felt the weight of her family's deception. That would explain why she asked Mother Superior to help Sister Agnes access the old records." "Precisely. Sister Catherine was trying to make amends in her own way. She couldn't bring herself to tell Sister Agnes directly. That would have been too painful, too much of a betrayal of her family's trust. But she could ensure that Sister Agnes had the opportunity to discover the truth for herself." Miss Marple paused in her knitting to adjust her spectacles, which had slipped down her nose. "People often choose such indirect methods when they feel torn between loyalty and honesty. Sister Catherine was loyal to her family's memory, but she was also honest enough to recognise that Sister Agnes deserved to know what had happened to Eleanor's child. And the altered date in the register, the one that changed Sister Catherine's death from the 13th to the 12th of September. I believe that was Sister Agnes's doing after Sister Catherine died. She was searching for patterns, you see, trying to understand if there were other irregularities in the burial records. When she examined Sister Catherine's entry and realised the date had been recorded incorrectly, or perhaps she thought it had been recorded incorrectly, she made the change. It was her way of ensuring accuracy, even in small matters. But why would the date have mattered? Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. It may not have mattered at all, or it may have been that Sister Agnes was looking for evidence of other falsified records, other instances where the burial committee had concealed inconvenient truths. She was learning to question everything she had once taken on faith. Lady Bantry was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. It's rather sad when you think about it. Sister Agnes spent her entire adult life in that convent, believing she had lost everyone she loved in a single winter. And then, just days before her own death, she learned that her sister's child had survived and been raised well. Such a brief time to feel that relief. "But she did feel it," Miss Marple said gently. "Mother Superior told me that when she brought Sister Agnes the adoption records, the old woman wept with joy. Not grief, not anger at having been deceived for so long, but pure joy that Eleanor's child had lived and been loved. That knowledge, brief though her possession of it was, gave Sister Agnes peace. The prayer she spoke aloud, the one the Fletchers heard, that was her way of giving thanks, and of ensuring that someone would remember. Sister Agnes knew she was dying, Dolly. Her heart was failing and she had very little time left. But she wanted the truth to be witnessed, even if it could not be fully explained. By praying aloud, she created a mystery that would draw attention to her death. She knew that someone, perhaps Mother Superior, perhaps you or I, would ask questions, and those questions would eventually lead to Mrs. Thornton learning who she truly was. Lady Bantry shook her head in wonder. Such elaborate planning, all in the service of ensuring one woman learned the truth about her birth. It seems almost excessive. Not excessive, Miss Marple corrected gently. Necessary. Sister Agnes understood that truth matters, even when it comes late, especially when it comes late. Mrs. Thornton had spent her entire life wondering about her birth mother, carrying that question like a weight she couldn't set down. Sister Agnes wanted to give her daughter, her niece I should say, the gift of knowing where she came from and knowing that she had been wanted and loved. She set aside her knitting and rose to fetch something from her desk. It was the small fragment of burned paper, still wrapped in her handkerchief that she had recovered from Sister Agnes's grate. "I showed this to Inspector Slack yesterday. He agreed that it appeared to be part of a burial permit from 1916, but he also agreed that there was no practical purpose in pursuing the matter further. The people involved are all dead now, except for Mrs. Thornton, and she has no wish to expose the scandal that surrounded her birth. The official records will remain as they are." "And Eleanor's grave? Will it be marked with the truth about how she died?" "No, Mrs. Thornton asked that her mother's headstone remain unchanged. She said Eleanor had been at peace for 40 years, and there was no need to disturb that peace now. But she has planted a climbing rose beside the grave, the same variety that Sister Agnes once tended the convent garden. I think Sister Agnes would have approved." Lady Bantry reached for the teapot, found it empty, and rose to ring for more. "You know, Jane, when this all began, I thought it was simply a case of an elderly nun dying of natural causes. I never imagined it would lead to such revelations." "Few people do imagine such things," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "We assume that quiet lives contain no drama, that religious communities are immune to the complications of family and scandal. But human nature is the same everywhere, Dolly. In convents as in villages, people love and lose, make mistakes, and carry secrets, try to protect others, and sometimes cause harm in the process." Sister Agnes certainly carried her secret for a very long time. 40 years, Miss Marple agreed, though I don't think it was precisely a secret she carried. It was more of a question, an uncertainty that she could neither resolve nor forget. The not knowing must have been its own kind of suffering. But she found her answer in the end. She did, and she ensured that her niece would find answers as well. That prayer she spoke at midnight, it wasn't just for Eleanor's soul, though it was certainly that. It was also a kind of testimony, a witness to the fact that truth had finally been discovered and acknowledged. Sister Agnes wanted someone to hear her speak that prayer, to know that she had made her peace with the past. Lady Bantry returned to her seat, her expression thoughtful. "Truth has a way of waking people at midnight. Wasn't that what you said just after the funeral?" "Did I? How prescient of me." Miss Marple's eyes held a gentle humour. "Though I suspect what I meant was that truth has a way of demanding acknowledgement, even when we would prefer to let sleeping secrets lie. Sister Agnes could have died without ever knowing what became of Eleanor's child. Mother Superior might have quietly destroyed the adoption records and never mentioned them to Mrs. Thornton. The whole matter could have remained buried with the dead. But it didn't. No, because Sister Agnes chose to speak her prayer aloud, and because Mrs. Thornton chose to seek the truth about her mother's deathbed confession, and because... Sometimes, Dolly, the truth simply will not stay silent. It whispers in the night, it leaves footprints in the frost, it survives even in fragments of burned paper, it insists on being heard. The November afternoon had faded into early evening, and Miss Marple rose to draw the curtains against the gathering darkness. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead lay quiet under a sky that promised rain before morning. In the churchyard, Eleanor Cunningham rested beneath her simple stone, a new climbing rose planted at her side. And in the convent of St. Aldhelm, the sisters went about their evening prayers, their voices rising in the ancient rhythms of devotion. But in one cell, now occupied by a younger sister who knew nothing of its history, a window stood slightly ajar, letting in the cold November air. And if that young sister sometimes thought she heard the faint echo of a prayer spoken long ago, she said nothing of it, attributing the sound to wind or imagination. Some truths, after all, need only be spoken once to be remembered forever. Miss Marple returned to her chair and took up her knitting once more, her needles creating something new from wool that had been something else entirely not so long ago. Transformation, she reflected, was the common currency of human life,